Anyway, so there we are. I wanted to share Anselm because he's like me. He's a great lover of reason, and it was him that really kick-started the whole university education in Europe. We call it scholasticism, which some people insult and say, oh, just scholasticism. No, what it was the reasoned attempt to think through the mysteries. And as an intellectual, you know, a teacher of philosophy, I'm in that lineage. Anselm was around at the same time as Abelard, who was giving talks in Paris, where the University of Paris came from. And Oxford was founded just after that, and Cambridge soon after. And then, you know, European intellectuals, we've been trying to figure this out ever since. I think it's important that we continue to do so. And Anselm, in some ways, is our founding father. And what a great European intellectual he was. I'm just a little spear carrier coming after. I also want to share a couple of other things before I finish that I hope you'll enjoy. I've been working on my Tarot of the Gods. Now, I'm not sure what Anselm would think about this, but, you know, I am an interfaith guy. I'm a Druid as well as a Christian, and I'm also a Buddhist and a shaman and, you know, Sufi and all the rest of it. So, you see, I mean, Anselm only had access to certain degrees of knowledge. If you look at the periodic table above me, Anselm didn't know all that. He couldn't, because explorers hadn't gone. They hadn't even discovered America, for God's sake, unless you know, wandering Celtic missionaries like Brendan the Navigator had got there earlier, which I think they had. So they had a smaller view of the world, which is summed up in the Mappa Mundi in Hereford Cathedral from about that time, which is well worth seeing. But so I think what we have to do now is given now we know the world and the complexity of all the religions and so on, like in the periodic table behind me, which is a nice poster that has been put together, and you can get a copy of this poster if you email me. It can be shipped to you from Canada. So we need to deepen and update the arguments, like the ontological argument, you know, for God. I mean, it's complicated because there are actually many gods. There are many religions that Anselm didn't know about. And I don't think it's justified to say, well, my religion is the true one and your religion is the devil. Of a certain type of simplistic Christian used to go around the world colonizing it and saying, well, these natives in the forest, they're all pagans and devil worshippers. I mean, come on, that's just colonial nonsense. The same when it was done by Muslims who were going around conquering parts of the world, saying, well, only Allah, only Islam, and only the Quran, and those people are devil worshippers. I think we've got to grow out of that kind of intellectual violence, which is what it is, and we have to come to an interfaith enlightenment. You know, I believe that all these different philosophical systems, religious systems, are vehicles towards enlightenment, which is the point of them all. Surely Anselm would agree with me on that. As he did say in many times, and we should therefore find the best tools of gnosis within each of them. So anyway, that's why I'm doing my Tarot of the Gods, and I've been working on a very interesting god the last few days, and it'll be in the book when it's finished, which will be, I hope, within a couple of weeks. And I've been working on a Tibetan and Bon god. Very interesting figure called Pehar. Now, Pehar was the most important Bon deities. What is the Bon religion? Well, it's one of the boxes. It's the pagan or Druid or ancient shamanic faith of Tibet. Long before Buddhism, Tibetans were there living on that incredible plateau of high landscape, and it was their indigenous shamanic religion. It was just like Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism, which you should read. They communed with the spirits, they communed with nature, with the trees, with the sky. And they particularly loved the sky because living in Tibet, you know, it's mostly sky. You're up so high that you're near the sky, you're aware of the stars, the clouds, the incredible patterns of the sky. You see the sun on Mount Everest and so on. I mean, I've been to the Himalayas. It is an extraordinary part of the world. Jean Overton Fuller was there as well, by the way, and so was Madame Blavatsky. who travelled through to Shigatse, to Tashi Lumpo, and studied there with the Panchen Lama in the 1860s. And Jean tracks down, the details. That's where Blavatsky met her teacher, Moria, and also where she met D.K. Choual-Koul, who was then a young man in his about 14 years of age, studying with Moria. Fascinating stuff. Imagine being at Shigatse in the 1860s. Anyway, they would have met Bon practitioners, because the Panchen Lama, who was the spiritual head of Tibetan Buddhism, and still is, was the counterpart to the Buddhist political head, who's the Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama does all the official PR, diplomacy, all that stuff, but it was the Panchen Lama that actually taught people the innermost secrets of existence. And they liked the Bon tradition. Panchen Lamas were clever. You see, the Bon tradition believes their founder, Shenrab, lived 16,000 BC. What? Like Christ was 2,000 and a bit years ago. I mean, Shenrab lived 16,000 years ago. And they'd been happily living in Tibet doing their Bon practices ever since. Okay, what is Bon practice? Well, it's working with, weaving with, navigating with the gods, the spirit beings, nature, and what it is to be human, what it is to be a full human, to be fully enlightened. It was a tradition based on prayer, on spells, on pacification of the demons, because the demons can get uppity. They can look at what they've done to Putin and co. When the gods are not properly reverenced, they turn people mad, as they did to Hitler and so on. So these Bon people, they were master shamans trying to keep humanity sane. Eliade puts it that the shaman works for the psychic integrity of the community. When Buddhism came to Tibet, particularly in tantric form with Padmasambhava, he encountered Bon shamans, and traditionally there was a great magical battle between them, and they were flying around Mount Kailash, which was the heartland of the Bon religion. And the tradition is that Padmasambhava, won the race up to the top of the mountain, and the Bon guy had to give in, and okay, you won. I think it was different. I think what they did is they sat down and they compared magical notes, and they realised that the Buddha Dharma in its tantric form is incredible and profound, and so is the Bon. And they did a kind of marriage, and Padmasambhava, it is said, asked Pehar, the great sky god of the Bon, to become a protector of the Dharma. So Pehar became, instead of being an enemy, like, oh, we hate Buddhists, go away, we'll kill you all, Pehar said, no, actually I love these Buddhists, they're very clever, they're teaching universal Dharma, they're teaching truth, the Eightfold Way, the path of virtue, right speech, right thought, right action. They're profound seers, so let's welcome them into Tibet, but let's make them marry up in a sort of interfaith harmony with the indigenous shamans, the Bon. And so Pehar became a protector of both the Bon and the Buddhists, and that's why I like him as a deity, and that's why I chose him for my tarot deck. With his consort, he had a beautiful consort, and both of them were always happy flying about Tibet around Mount Kailash and making love in the sky surrounded by rainbows. That was their idea of a good night out. And who's to say it isn't a good idea? So Pehar, I want to share, he's an amazing deity, and I've been researching the Bon traditions in order to write up exactly all the details, and they're absolutely fascinating. I've had a long love affair with Tibetan Buddhism. It was the first religion that, when I read Chogyam Trungpa cutting through spiritual materialism way back in the day, opened my eyes to the transpersonal realms. I realised that the kind of materialism that they were teaching in Brighton Grammar School was just that. It was a narrative that it didn't satisfy me, it didn't nourish my spirit. But I realised these Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana masters are so much more profound. And now, on the spiral of learning, I realised, well, it's because they borrowed so much from the Bon, who go back to 16,000 BC as shamans. I mean, so profound stuff. That leads me to my next point, which is that this sort of question of spirituality and knowledge, a lot of what I've talked in these talks is about spirituality, and I am a teacher, obviously, an educator, and I'm trying to save humanity through knowledge and learning, and that's why I've taught at the University of Oxford and London, and why I've created my own university, the Global Green University now, and why I set up my institute at the University of London back in the 90s, and why I worked tirelessly as an educator for peace. But what is the model of knowledge? What's the point of learning? You see, in today's world, we have this view that's got out into schools and universities even, that all the kind of knowledge I'm sharing is just, well, it's romantic, antiquarian nonsense. It doesn't matter. I mean, real knowledge is chemistry and physics and maths and computing science and business. There's this utilitarian turn, which is very materialist, that academia has taken, and that's then influenced the school education systems. And so what I'm proud to be part of is a thing called the Galileo Commission, which is set up and chaired by my friend David Lorimer of the Scientific and Medical Network, which is a network of international thinkers and scientists and medical experts who've been researching, let's call it, new paradigms of science. The old model, 19th century billiard ball physics, is out. Quantum physics, Heisenberg and people, as David points out, realise that consciousness is actually the fundamental reality underneath existence. Going back to Anselm's point about the ontology of God, in a sense, that is the supreme field of consciousness, that in Tibetan and Bon religion is the field or ground from which Rigpa arises. Rigpa is the Tibetan word for divine mind, enlightened mind. And the Gzi, which is the basis of everything, which is where space and time come from, is itself enlightened consciousness. So, and what's extraordinary is that now scientists, people that work with empirical evidential science are now realising that seems to be the case. And there's enormous, discoveries being made on the frontiers of biology, chemistry, physics, and so on, that show that consciousness is somehow embedded into the very structure of reality, at the level of particles, cells, organic life. We are made of this implicit consciousness energy that is in existence itself at that microcellular, microparticle level. So anyway, that's the Galileo Commission. And what we did yesterday online, some of my friends were there, is we launched a new thing, which is a very important initiative, to see this knowledge brought into the humanities. Because scientists know this, good ones, truly, profoundly learned physicists like Heisenberg, like Oppenheimer, like Einstein, they've always known this. Biologists have known this since Alfred Russel Wallace and so on. There's been that tradition of and Sir Alister Hardy was another great biologist who knew about the implicit consciousness within organic life. But it's not really broken through into the humanities, and even in the humanities now, particularly in some parts of the world, academics have to conform to a very rigid materialist perspective to have their work counted as true, or as academic. I mean, I taught at the University of Oxford, and I didn't experience that. I've always, proper universities obviously know that true knowledge is about spirituality as well. And there's a profound work in religious studies and theology done at Oxford over the centuries, going back to Gross Tester, who was one of the first vice-chancellors. But I think kind of lesser universities, they want to become like official, so they've adopted this materialist paradigm, and they promote a kind of view of knowledge that is to to be real knowledge, it has to be scientific, has to be materialist. And obviously this was the case in the whole world of Marxist dialectical materialism. To prove that you're a serious thinker, you had to quote your Marx and Engels, and matter is the substitute for God. You know, they tried to explain away religion as a sort of delusion caused by the wrong atoms firing in the brain, like a sort of schizophrenia. Anyway, it was a really profound conference. We had a mini conference for a couple of hours. And I'm just going to run through, because if you didn't get a chance to come, it was, I think, epochal, and I want to thank David for organising it and the others. One of the speakers was a lovely woman from Athens, one of my other great homeland cities, right? Socrates and Plato and all the gang were from there. Anyway, this woman is called Athena. She looks like the goddess Athena. And she's such a clever lady. She's done her PhD at Oxford, where I used to teach, in political philosophy, which I've also taught, and she's now a fellow at the Centre for Greek Studies at Harvard. She's deeply versed and learned in the classical tradition of Greece, and she rightly has put together an article, a manifesto, for the rediscovery of the spiritual roots of the humanities. You know, what's the point of learning languages or history or geography or philosophy or any of these things I'm talking about, religious studies, if there isn't anything spiritual in life? You know, this is all just antiquated knowledge. Stick it in a museum and you know, forget about it and get on with computer science and money making. No, what Athena's saying, and I agree with her 100%, is that the purpose of studying the humanities, the purpose of learning philosophy and religious studies and history is to fly the flag of wisdom, you know, in the heart of academia. That's the point of learning all this stuff, because it makes you a better person. It's food for the soul. As I was saying when I rejected the kind of narrow materialist bandwidth that in the 1970s they taught in grammar schools and even at the University of Bristol, it was run by materialists, and I didn't have the intellectual depth of learning in those days. I was only like 19 to know how to combat their arguments. We were, you know, forced to read Wittgenstein and A.J. Ayer as the pinnacle of all possible human wisdom. Logical positivism was the final word on the non-existence of God, and if you questioned that, you were like some deviant. Well, thank God things have moved on. I mean, Bristol has a flourishing religious studies department now, which was run for many years by my dear friend and colleague, Professor Ursula King. And, you know, it has a great centre for Buddhist studies and so on. So we now know, and as Athena said yesterday, that if you study Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions, you know that this narrow nationalism, narrow materialism is just one box. You know, materialism is a box on the periodic table, no problem. I don't have a problem with genuine materialist scientists who research matter and who do particle physics and do the details of DNA and biomolecular biology and so on. It's fascinating stuff and very, very necessary. What I have a problem with is if they then say that's all the knowledge that's possible. All of the great works of literature and the arts and philosophy, they're all just bunk, you know, because only matter exists. That's what we were fighting back against yesterday. Other speakers were Professor Ian McGilchrist, a philosopher at Oxford, spoke very eloquently, saying the same kind of thing, that we need to have an openness of mind in our discourse in academia around the humanities. Very important talk by Jeffrey Kripal, who's the Dean of Humanities at Rice University in America. Very learned man who's written wonderful books about the history of Esalen and all kinds. He's a specialist in new religious movements, really, and a great colleague and scholar of mine. And he was on good form and saying that the problem is that in conventional universities in America now, they're so disparaging of spirituality that you get people in the staff from the common room saying things like, well, it's no longer not only God doesn't exist, but truth doesn't exist. There's no such thing as truth. so the values that we thought academia stood for, truth, beauty, love, no, none of that exists. All that exists is evil, shadow, dark. So sort of malevolence is beginning to take over the academy. And Jeffrey's on the front line because he's the head of humanities. I mean, anyway, he's written a book called The Super Humanities, and he talked about having created a wonderful website which he called Unleashing, Unleashing the Miraculous, effectively. He's tried to say that the humanities are sitting on opening the archives of the impossible. There are so many anomalies in the conventional materialist narrative about existence. Things like near-death experience, it's one of the huge ones. If we survive death and consciousness survives, then obviously consciousness is somehow fundamental and is not restricted to our physical form, but is just inhabiting that physical form for our lifespan. And the evidence for that, I think, is overwhelming if you actually look at it scientifically. And obviously science is all about evidence, so we can't dispute the evidence. The problem with the people that don't want to look at the evidence is they won't look through the telescope, and this is the point of the Galileo Commission. Because Galileo tried to get a professor at the University of Padua, where he taught, to look through his telescope at the discoveries he made in space, and the guy refused. I won't look through the telescope, he said. Well, some intellectuals, some academics are still like that. They're stuck in the I won't look at the evidence mode. Well, this is what I call Sophiaphobia. It's a fear of wisdom, a fear of knowledge. Because if you look through the telescope and if you realise, wow, these Bon people knew a thing or two for 16,000 years. They knew all about life after death and consciousness and how consciousness flies around and then goes back into another womb or whatever. All that stuff was pioneered by them. Well, no, I can't look through that telescope, or I might have to rethink my cosmology, And my cosmology has been very helpful for justifying imperialism and colonialism and suppressing all these primitive people because they're just all crazy, so I can go and conquer them and steal their wealth. Well, no, it's time to look through the telescope, people. And as Anne Baring said, another of the speakers, a wonderful feminist scholar, Jungian scholar, who's written about the goddess mysteries, as she was saying, the problem with the Ukraine war and all those kind of military escapades is that it's premised on this sort of patriarchal, narrow, monofocus on power and on domination and on oppressing the indigenous knowledge, the shamanic, the pagan, the Bon, if you want, or the Druid, because the Druids are the Bon of Britain. That's why I'm a Druid, because I identify with that ancient wisdom that's so much older than the written traditions like Christianity or even Buddhism, although that's 500 years older than Christianity. These written religions are very recent. It's the green ones, the pagan ones in the periodic table that are the oral traditions, which are primal. My friend Lord Combermere, who appointed me as a lecturer at Birkbeck, used to say, look, these are the primal religions, Thomas. Like the American Indian religion, the Druid, all the others predating writing, the African shamans and so on. So that's where the Bon come from. And we were talking, anyway, it was a fascinating conference yesterday. Another speaker was Professor Keith Ward, who's the lecturer in divinity, professor of divinity at the University of Oxford. And I've known Keith for many years. He once gave a lecture when I was teaching at the Institute of Education at the University of London on peace studies, and he gave a talk about Christianity and love. And Keith is a very, humble but deep thinker. And he spoke yesterday very well about the need to revive this knowledge of spirituality within the humanities themselves. So thank you to Keith. And yeah, it was a moving experience. So it was a launch of something. So if you want to get involved, contact me, contact the Galileo Commission. We have a website, it's very, very good. My friend David Lorimer would be delighted to invite you to future such events. And this is why I've set up the Global Green University, because much as I love Oxford, London, whatever, teaching there is this constraint on you. You can't, there are still certain areas you can't explore. So the Global Green University is a new initiative, I suppose just as Aristotle set up the Lyceum because he wanted to expand it to new areas of thought. So I felt it was appropriate to set up. And there are several similar types of alternative universities. Ubiquity University in America, run by a colleague of mine, and there are others scattered about. So we're kind of kindred spirits doing our thing. And within the Global Green University, we demand the same rigour as the University of Oxford, but the area of study you can do is much more broad. Most conventional universities try and narrow you down. If you're doing a PhD, you have to really chip away and do one tiny tenth of what you start out wanting to do. Well, we say the complete opposite. The Green University is about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. You can't do a PhD with us unless you draw on at least 5 or 6 different knowledge fields and integrate them into an interlocking system. What we need now is interdisciplinarity, because it's monodisciplinarity that is the root cause of our problems on the planet intellectually. As Vandana Shiva says, monoculture has ruined agriculture, so mono-intellectual culture has ruined academia. In the days of Ansel, all knowledge is interconnected. And the days of Albertus Magnus, he knew that. That's what I'm saying we need to go back to with the Green University. Okay, so now that's why I'm working with the World Intellectual Forum, because that's my commitment as coordinator of that in Europe here, is to try and wake up the intellectuals so that we speak out against war. Because war begins with this mono-intellectual culture, this Russian thinkers like Dugin, they're just trained in one little thing, like Russianness. The kind of Marine Le Pen's types are trained in Frenchness, the Brexit types. Capitalism in a sense is premised on that, keeping people narrow-minded so they're fit to work in a factory and just turn out profits for you. Marxism, which tried to oppose that with its Renaissance man vision didn't work because human nature wasn't ready for it then. Pierre Leroux and the others criticised Marx. They said, you can't leave spirit out. If you want a genuine communist society living in peace, as Saint-Simon and Robert Owen and Pierre Leroux wanted, you've got to keep spirit in, because it's the only way we can get there. If we can empower people's spirituality, we can get there. Now, Marx wouldn't have it, because he was thinking in his typical, he can only do his own vision, which he then imposed on other people, of materialism, which fundamentally is a flawed and insufficient metaphysics to marshal human intelligence in the direction of liberty, equality, fraternity, and intelligence. So anyway, the World Intellectual Forum are carrying on. There's stresses and strains about Ukraine war. Should we be neutral? Should we take Ukraine's side? Should we be on NATO's side? What about the things NATO's done in the past that are wrong, like the invasion of Iraq? So it's not that it's all plain sailing. Intellectuals can disagree, and they can put their evidence forward, and they can argue for their points. And my job as coordinator is to try and see the dialogue continue in a civilized way that can move forward the argument to peace. I feel very much humanity's like stuck in the woods, like in Tolkien in the Lord of the Rings. We're stuck in Mirkwood, the great forest of evil dragons and whatever, and we're all fighting in the dark, arguing over who's got the best tree. We have to get out of the forest and into the plain, into the valley, into enlightenment, where we can see that these kind of war games we've been doing, which are mind games as well, are not helpful. And that leads me to my final point, really, is that's why I'm teaching a course on enlightenments. And I hope you will join us. Me and Satyen Raja put this course together and it's based partly on the periodic table. What we're doing is looking at enlightenments across all the traditions. There's enlightenment in Buddhism in all the different schools. There's enlightenment in tantric thought. There's enlightenment in Hindu yoga, Advaita Vedanta. There's enlightenment in the Christian theological tradition, theosis, the downloading of the God force into one's consciousness. There's enlightenment in Islam when you surrender to Allah and Allah comes into you. There's surrender in the Kabbalah, in Jewish thought, when the sage, the rabbi, becomes a vehicle for the downloading of the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, and so on, in all the traditions. And there are many tools that have been developed in this modern era for increasing the enlightenment quotient of the planet, and that's what this course is about. It's pioneering. It's the first ever of its kind in world history, so far as I'm aware, because we're looking at runic traditions, Druid, shamanic, all the different schools of thought. So, you can join, even though it started last month, you can still join us. It's the third Friday of each month. You can register. It's very inexpensive. We've kept it very affordable, and then you get access to last month's in retrospect, and going forward it's going to last a whole year. I hope the planet will benefit from this. It's our own karmic good work to advance this planetary enlightenment that we so badly need. Okay, so that's enough from me. I'm going to finish. I've got only a couple more things now. So I finally got my British passport through. I've been waiting 6 months. I applied and they kept losing it. So this is my other identity. I'm a Canadian. I'm also British. In law, that's needed to live in France. You have to have your British passport to prove you're British. But I just want to comment briefly about British politics, because obviously I still vote in Britain, and for those of you that aren't British, fine, you can have a little rest. But I think it's really important that Boris Johnson is finally sacked. I mean, he is the worst Prime Minister of my life. He's an evil, ignorant, and lying fool. And, it looks like his karma's finally catching up on him. It's been proved that he's lied to the Parliament so many times. Finally, the committee will investigate that, and it looks like what Parliament has the right to do is, if somebody's deliberately misled the House, it can expel them for a few weeks. And I think they should do that with Boris Johnson. It's the only way. Just bar him from entry. I don't care if he's Prime Minister. He's a liar, and he should be barred from being in Parliament. He has no more right to be in Parliament than I do, or any decent person. So bar him from the building. I'd say bar him from the actual building, actually. And then what happens is, if he's barred for 3 weeks, then there's an automatic recall election in his constituency. And then if 10% of his constituent electors then vote to recall this man, he's sacked. And there has to be then an election in his seat. That is probably the way to get rid of this evil, lying person. And I can't wait as that unfolds over the next few weeks. I mean, he's been in India, and he's always scheming. The sooner he's out of Downing Street and Parliament, the better. So that's just a bit of good news. I think myself, now that I've come to realise how vicious Russian assaults on British democracy have been, and they've given us Boris Johnson, by the way. This is the present from Putin and his oligarchs. That's why he's got to go, because he's brought in this Putin-style rulership in Britain that is immune to morality, immune to evidence, immune to reason, immune to democracy. That's how Putin governs Russia, and Boris has tried to do it in Britain.